Okay, so today we're going to dive into the work of a thinker whose impact is, well, let's just say it's massive. I mean, you could even make the argument that a lot of modern philosophy is basically trying to figure out how to respond to this one guy.
Yeah, I'd say that's fair.
We've talked about, Plato casting a long shadow and all that, but for the modern era, that towering figure, the one everyone's still wrestling with, has got to be Immanuel Kant.
Definitely. Kant was born in the 18th century, and he didn't just, add to philosophy. He kind of turned the whole thing on its head. Like, he
Yeah.
was trying to build a bridge between faith and reason, and in doing so, he reshaped how we think about, everything. Science, ethics, even how we understand the universe itself, all of it.
And that's exactly what we're going to try to unpack today. You've put together this incredible collection of his writings, along with some background on his life. And our mission here is to distill those complex ideas, give everyone listening a shortcut to understanding why Kant still matters so much. Hopefully, we'll uncover some surprising connections along the way.
You know, what always strikes me about Kant is how ambitious he was. He tackled some of the biggest questions there are. How do we know anything for sure? What does it mean to be free? Where do our moral judgments come from? I mean, he even had these revolutionary ideas about how the solar system formed. So as we go through this, think about this. How much of what we take for granted about ourselves and the world has been maybe subtly influenced by Kant's thinking?
It's kind of wild to consider, right? All right, let's start with something that sounds pretty straightforward, but I have a feeling it's way more loaded than it seems. Kant's 1784 essay, What is Enlightenment? You mark this as the essential starting point.
Yeah, it really lays the groundwork. In this essay, Kant defines enlightenment as basically humanity finally growing up. We're emerging from what he calls self-imposed immaturity. But the important thing here is how he defines that immaturity.
Okay, so not just a lack of intelligence or something.
Right, exactly. It's not about people being incapable of understanding. It's more like they lack the guts, the courage to use their own minds without needing someone else to guide them, intellectually speaking.
So it's not that they can't think for themselves, it's that they choose not to.
That's a good way to put it. And Kant's pretty blunt about why this happens. He points to laziness and cowardice. It's just easier to let someone else do the heavy lifting. Right. And that leaves the door wide open for these guardians to step in, people who are more than happy to do the thinking for everyone else.
Which brings us to that super famous line, saper aude, dare to know, have the courage to use your own understanding. It's like this timeless rallying cry for intellectual freedom.
And what's fascinating, even in this relatively accessible essay, you can see Kant starting to grapple with the bigger philosophical issues he'd really dig into later. Especially that tension between how we understand the world and our capacity for freedom. He saw this as a huge problem to solve. If the natural world works according to strict cause and effect, then how can humans who are part of that world actually be free in their choices?
It's that classic dilemma, right? If everything is just a chain reaction, then where does free will fit in? And it seems like this tension is what led him to write those massive critiques.
Exactly. Those three critiques, the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, and the critique of the power of judgment, those are Kant's attempt to tackle this core problem from every angle. The critique of pure reason, which he published first, is mostly about establishing the basis for scientific knowledge. But a big part of that project was also making room for human freedom in a world that seems to be governed by natural laws.
So he's trying to figure out how we can know things scientifically while also saying, but hey, we have free will too.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Then, in the critique of practical reason, he shifts gears and focuses on morality. He argues that our awareness of freedom doesn't come from some abstract proof, but from our own internal experience of making moral choices. It's that feeling, that inner sense of being free that connects us to what he calls the moral law. It's not something imposed on us from outside.
Interesting. So it's not like we prove we're free, but we feel it through our moral choices.
Right. And then finally, the critique of the power of judgment. This one explores our aesthetic experiences, like what we find beautiful, and also these things he called teleological questions, which are about purpose and design in the natural world. That includes the question of God's role. So across these three major works, he's building this comprehensive system. He addresses how we know, how we act, how we experience beauty and purpose, all while trying to reconcile natural laws with human freedom.
That's a lot to try and fit together. And earlier you mentioned something about a Copernican revolution in philosophy. Okay, can you unpack that for us? Because that sounds like a pretty big deal.
Oh, it was. It was a total game changer. Just like Copernicus revolutionized astronomy by putting the sun at the center of the solar system, Kant did something similar for philosophy. His Copernican turn proposed that our minds are way more active in shaping our experience of the world than anyone had thought before.
So the world isn't just sitting out there like a bunch of facts that we passively absorb. We're actually shaping it.
That's the gist of it. Kant argued that even basic things about our experience, like space, time, and cause and effect, those aren't just features of reality that our minds pick up on. Instead, they're the very structures that our minds use to organize and make sense of our sensory experiences.
Whoa, hold on. So space and time aren't like, I don't know, these giant containers that the universe exists in. They're more like frameworks that our minds create.
Yeah, that's a really good way to think about it. And this idea leads to his concept of transcendental idealism. Now, I know that phrase can sound kind of intimidating, but the main point is that Kant didn't deny that things exist outside of us. But he argued that we don't directly experience those things as they are in themselves. Everything we experience is always filtered and shaped by how our minds work.
So it's not like we're living in a fantasy world that our minds just make up, but our perception of reality, how we see things, that's being shaped by our minds.
Exactly. He even talks about a transcendental ego. You could think of it like the underlying software of our minds that's always running, organizing all the incoming data. This ego takes raw sensations and uses categories like substance and cause to create our understanding of the world. As he put it later, we ourselves create the elements of knowledge of the world, like building blocks, from which, on the condition of being simultaneously inhabitants of the world, we construct a worldview in idea.
That quote really emphasizes how active our minds are in shaping how we see things. And I remember you pointing out another quote, "Only that which is in us can be immediately and directly perceived." That really highlights how internal our experience is, how much it's shaped by our own mental tools.
It does, and it's important to distinguish Kant's idealism from other kinds. He was really adamant that he wasn't like Berkeley, who argued that basically only minds and ideas exist and the material world isn't real. Kant also differentiated himself from Descartes, whose idealism had trouble proving that anything existed beyond the individual mind. Kant specifically said that an idealist doesn't deny that things exist outside of us, only that we know about them through our specific way of perceiving and understanding. We infer their existence because they're the external cause of what we sense.
Okay, so it's like the world is out there, it's real, but our relationship with it is super active. We're constantly shaping our perception of it using the built-in structure of our minds.
You got it. This Copernican revolution, putting the active mind at the center of how we understand reality, it had this huge and lasting impact on all of Western philosophy that came after.
So we've covered how we know things, at least according to Kant, but then he shifts gears and starts talking about how we act, how we make moral decisions. So how does this new way of looking at knowledge connect to his ideas about right and wrong?
Well, after arguing that human reason is autonomous in shaping how we understand things, it makes sense that Kant would then explore the autonomy of the human will when it comes to ethics. He was wrestling with this basic question, what is the right thing to do? And his approach was pretty different from the other big ethical theories floating around at the time.
Yeah, you mentioned that he wasn't on board with utilitarianism, that whole idea of maximizing happiness, which was popular with thinkers like Bentham and Mill.
Right. Kant argued that just focusing on the consequences of our actions, doing this happiness calculation, could lead to situations where people get treated like tools to achieve some greater good. They're not seen as individuals with their own inherent worth. He also wasn't a fan of strict moral absolutism, where there are these fixed rules that apply no matter what the situation is.
So he's looking for something between just focusing on outcomes and blindly following rules?
Exactly. And his solution was the famous categorical imperative. The most well-known way to phrase it is, act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law.
Okay, and act only according to that personal rule that you could want everyone to follow all the time. It's still a bit abstract. Can we get a real-world example?
Sure. Think of a maxim as the underlying principle you're using when you make a decision. The categorical imperative asks you, could you rationally want everyone to act based on that same principle in all similar situations? If your maxim becoming a universal law leads to a contradiction or something totally irrational, then acting on that maxim is morally wrong. So say your maxim is, I'll lie whenever it benefits me. Could you want that to be a universal law? If everyone lied all the time, the concept of truth, of believing someone, would completely break down.
So it's like a test. Can your personal rule become a universal rule without causing chaos?
Exactly. He also gives other ways to phrase the categorical imperative that can help make it clearer. For example, he says, act as if the maxim of your action were to become through your will a universal law of nature. That emphasizes how your personal rules should fit into the basic order of a rational world.
You also mentioned the I sought distinction. How does that work in Kant's ethics?
Kant was super aware that you can't just derive moral oughts, like what we should do, from just observing what is in the world. Just because people act selfishly, that doesn't mean selfishness is morally good. And a key part of his ethics is the idea that ought implies can. If we have a moral duty to do something, it has to be actually possible for us to do it.
That makes sense. Obligations wouldn't mean much if they were impossible to fulfill.
Right. And in his book, The Metaphysics of Morals, Kant makes this strong argument against treating people as mere means to an end. This idea that we should always treat humanity, in ourselves and others, as an end in itself, never just as a tool that's a cornerstone of his whole ethical framework.
Which is related to his concept of the kingdom of ends, right?
Yeah, the kingdom of ends is this ideal world that Kant imagined, where everyone acts according to the categorical imperative, always treating each other and themselves as beings with inherent worth. In this kingdom, everything has either a price, meaning you can trade it for something else, or dignity, meaning it has this special, irreplaceable value. And for Kant, human beings have dignity.
It's interesting how he builds this whole ethical system on reason and universal principles, not on emotions, consequences, or even religious authority.
Yeah, and the fact that people are still talking about it and debating it today, that shows how powerful and logically rigorous his ideas were.
And it's easy to get lost in the abstract philosophy, but you also pointed out that Kant made some pretty significant contributions to science. That's not something people always associate with him.
Yeah, it's true. He's mostly known for his philosophy, but he was really interested in the natural sciences too. His most important contribution is probably his work on the Kant-Laplace theory of how our solar system formed.
Wait, the Kant-Laplace theory? I've heard of the nebular hypothesis, but I didn't realize Kant had anything to do with it.
That's the one. In his early work, Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens, which was published way back in 1755, long before his famous critiques, Kant proposed that the solar system came from this huge, rotating cloud of gas and dust, a nebula. He thought that gravity would cause the nebula to collapse and flatten out into the spinning disk, with the sun forming in the center and the planets coming together from the dust swirling around it.
For the mid-18th century, that's a pretty incredible idea.
It really was ahead of its time. The interesting thing is, this theory didn't get much attention while he was alive. It wasn't until decades later, in 1796, that a French astronomer, Pierre-Simon Laplace, independently came up with a really similar model. Eventually, people realized that Kant had said it first, and that's how it became known as the Kant-Laplace hypothesis. And it's still the foundation for how we understand the formation of solar systems.
So this philosopher who reshaped our understanding of knowledge and ethics, he also played a part in how we understand the cosmos. That's a pretty amazing legacy. And you mentioned a quote on his tombstone, right?
Yeah. In the Critique of Practical Reason, he wrote those famous words. Two things fill the mind with ever-increasing wonder and awe, the more often and the more intensely the mind of thought is drawn to them. The starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. And they actually put those words on his tombstone, reflecting his lifelong interest in both the natural world and human morality.
It's a beautiful quote, and it really captures how broad his intellectual interests were.
Okay, shifting gears again, let's dive into Kant's views on religion. You mentioned his upbringing, which was pretty devout, but also his focus on putting humanity at the center. How did he reconcile those two things?
Kant's relationship with religion is complicated. He was raised in a very religious, pietist household. But his philosophy, especially his critical philosophy, led him to a place where human reason and autonomy were the top priorities. And that shift is clear in how he wrote about religion.
Yeah, like you highlighted that quote where he said the wish to speak to God is absurd, which, coming from someone with his background, sounds pretty radical. It does. But you have to understand it in the context of his critical philosophy. Kant argued that human understanding is limited to what we experience, to the world of things that we can sense and categorize. And God, as a being that's beyond all that, is basically impossible for us to comprehend. So trying to have a conversation with something we can't even grasp, that's ultimately pointless in his view. As he said, we can only have faith in God.
So religion, for Kant, it's not about rituals and trying to have a direct line to God. It becomes more about an inner experience, about belief, and acting morally.
Exactly. He even said that the benefits of prayer are mainly subjective, like they might comfort us or give us motivation, but they're not actually communication with some divine being that we can understand. He argued that fulfilling our moral duties to each other, that's the best way to serve what we understand as God's will. This leads to what he called a merely moral religion, as opposed to a religion of worship that focuses on rituals and external practices.
And he was pretty critical of what he called superstition and religious madness when it came to trying to please God.
Yeah. He saw those practices like relying on miracles, doing certain rituals to get favors, seeking out special intermediaries. He saw all that as misguided attempts to get God's approval through ways other than being ethical. For Kant, true religion is in our moral character, in doing what's right because it's right, not because we're trying to get rewards or avoid punishment from God.
And what about his vision for the future of religion?
He thought that religion would gradually evolve, that it would slowly be freed from dogma and external rules, becoming a purely moral force driven by internal conviction. He imagined this as a slow, internal process of reform, a revelation divine constantly occurring in the soul of man, rather than a sudden revolution from outside.
It's a really interesting perspective on how religious thought could develop. And that quote you picked out, the death of dogma is the birth of morality, that sums it up nicely. It's about moving past blind faith to a more ethical way of being.
Absolutely. It suggests that true morality emerges when we stop clinging to rigid beliefs and ground our actions in reason and universal moral principles instead.
Okay, so shifting gears one more time. Kant's view of human nature always seemed kind of paradoxical to me. You pointed out that famous line of his, "Out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing can ever be made," which sounds super pessimistic about what we're capable of.
It does, and people often quote that line to say that he had a really bleak view of human nature. But it's important to understand that within the bigger context of how he thought about history and society, while he recognized that individual humans are flawed, he also believed that humanity as a whole could progress and become better.
So even if individual people mess up, he thought society could still improve.
Exactly. He actually thought that progress would be driven by the conflicts and tensions that naturally arise in society. This unsociable sociability, as he called it, our tendency to both cooperate and compete with each other, that's what eventually leads us to create legal systems and hopefully a universal civil society, maybe even a global federation of some kind.
So in a weird way, conflict can push us towards cooperation and a more just society.
That's the idea. He also pointed out that while we've become more cultivated and civilized through advancements in arts and social customs, that doesn't automatically mean we're more moral. For him, true morality lies in that inner disposition guided by reason and the categorical imperative. Just because a society looks civilized on the surface doesn't mean people are actually behaving ethically.
And that difference between just being civilized and being genuinely moral, that's something we're still grappling with today.
For sure. Kant believed that reason and freedom were the driving forces behind both individual and societal progress. He laid out some of these ideas in his essay, Idea for a Universal History, from a cosmopolitan point of view. He suggests that history itself has a kind of purpose, that it's moving towards the full development of human potential within a just and peaceful world.
So he had this long-term perspective on human development, even while acknowledging that we're all kind of messed up.
Exactly. He knew progress would be slow and there would be setbacks, but he fundamentally believed that humanity could become more rational and moral.
One part of Kant's ethics that people often debate is his hardline stance against lying, even when it seems like it would be the right thing to do. That feels so strict compared to how we usually think about morality in everyday life.
It does. Kant believed that telling the truth wasn't just a good thing to do, it was an absolute duty. He thought that lying destroys the foundation of trust and rational communication, which are essential for human society to function.
So even in extreme cases, like his famous example of lying to a murderer to protect their victim, he still said lying is wrong.
He did. He argued that if you lie, you become responsible for anything that happens as a result, even if you didn't intend for it to happen. But if you tell the truth, you can't be held accountable for any unexpected outcomes. He used that example, the one with the murderer, to show how complicated and potentially harmful it can be to try to manipulate the truth, even with good intentions. For Kant, honesty was paramount, and there were no exceptions, no matter the consequences.
It's definitely a tough ethical position to wrap your head around, especially when we often feel like a lie might be the better choice in some situations.
It definitely makes you think about the basic principles that shape how we decide what's right and wrong.
Okay, last but not least, let's talk about Kant's thoughts on education and character development. Given his emphasis on reason and autonomy, what were his big ideas about how to raise and educate people?
Kant thought education was about way more than just learning facts. It was about helping people develop into autonomous, rational individuals who could govern themselves morally. He thought freedom was crucial, but also discipline. You need discipline to guide that freedom. The ultimate goal was to help people develop a strong character based on the inherent dignity of humanity.
So, like finding that balance between giving kids independence and providing structure?
Exactly. He believed that we should encourage kids to think for themselves, to exercise their own understanding, remembering that seper ad, and to learn to respect the rights and freedom of others. He even suggested that part of learning should be negative, like figuring out what not to do, developing a strong aversion to things like lying.
So, it seems like he put a lot of emphasis on developing a good will, acting based on principle, rather than just following your whims or wanting reward.
Absolutely. He saw good character as the ability to figure out your own rules of conduct from within yourself, based on recognizing the inherent worth of humanity. A person with good character doesn't act impulsively. They act on their reasoned will, following established principles. He considered firmness and consistency in your principles to be super important for building character.
It sounds like he saw education as this lifelong process of cultivating reason, freedom, and a strong sense of responsibility.
You got it. He believed that the whole point of education was to help people reach their full potential as rational and moral beings in the world.
Wow, this has been a real deep dive into the world of Immanuel Kant. We've covered so much. Enlightenment, how our minds actively shape our reality, basing morality on universal principles, his contributions to science, his views on religion, his complex ideas about human nature and progress, his strong stance against lying, and his vision for education. It's mind-boggling to think about how influential his ideas have been.
It is amazing, isn't it? Thinking back to our initial question about how Kant has shaped our everyday thinking, I think we can see now how deep his ideas about autonomy, reason, and universal moral laws have become ingrained in Western thought. We often don't even realize where those ideas come from, but they're there.
So as we wrap up, let's leave everyone with a couple of questions to chew on. How do those core Kantian principles, autonomy and universal moral laws, how do those apply to the ethical dilemmas we're facing today? I mean, our world is so interconnected and complex, and thinking about his view of human nature where he acknowledges our flaws but still believes we can progress, how does that resonate with what you see happening in the world?
Those are really important questions for all of us to consider. And if this conversation has sparked your curiosity, I highly recommend checking out some of Kant's actual writings. His essay, What is Enlightenment?, is a good place to start, and it's pretty accessible. Or you could dive into sections of the Critique of Pure Reason or the Critique of Practical Reason. Those are more challenging, but they offer even deeper insights into his work and his legacy.
And on that note, we'll leave you with a final thought from Kant himself. Science is organized knowledge, wisdom is organized life. A good reminder to connect what we know with how we live.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.